Hello, I'm Alan Watt. This is cuttingthroughthematrix.com and .net with a few more sites to be added. This is February the 16th, 2007. Hopefully, because of the troubles, when you realize that your sites can be pulled so quickly and easily, we have no power, legal or otherwise, over the system which has temporarily been given to us, and that's how it must be viewed, as a temporary thing. Years ago they talked about the information wars prior to giving the public the internet. This was all planned long ago, before Joe Public even knew that computers would be on sale eventually to them. Brzezinski talked about this system of communication which would be made available to the public. Now, if they made it compulsory to have a computer, we'd be suspicious of their motives. And it wouldn't be hard for people then to start thinking for themselves and come to conclude, wait a minute here, what do they want us to put on these computers? Well, it's everything you have put on it, such as your banking, all your transactions, your purchases, and most of your life. In fact, some people put their whole lives on the computer, their personal lives. A dream that tyrants down through history could never have imagined, and yet it's been made available to us because we think it's somehow not quite free, but we purchase it, so it's of value, and that we have something to do with it, because we have a choice to purchase it or not. However, it's becoming evidently clear that apart from being a stepping stone towards a much larger system and a more nefarious system, we're going to be forced on computer. Governments have been pushing it and pushing it. It's mandatory almost. All children must have it, or you're leaving them behind, as they say. They won't get the same indoctrination as everyone else, and it's imperative that they all get the same world indoctrination for a world society. It's also extremely difficult and not so cost effective to have to monitor everyone the old-fashioned way by collecting gossip through various institutions scattered throughout your society, all Masonically linked, and going back to police stations where they gather all the gossip and trivia on everyone. It takes a lot of manpower to monitor telephones, as I've done in the past, and even opening your mail was a big chore, and we know they did, and they still do open mail in certain post office departments. If your name's on a list, your mail is diverted to a certain place where they can take it out, read it, reseal it in a brand new envelope, and give it the stamp of any country they wish, and the date. That was exposed by Peter Wright, who worked for MI5 and MI6 in his book called Spycatcher. So it's much easier when we get on the internet and disclose everything, thinking that we're free, and little old me wouldn't be watched because I'm very good. Good meaning you follow every rule that's given to you. You don't question anything. You don't question the whys or why the rules are there, or even who you are. You're a composite. If you're very good, you'd have to be a composite of what you were supposed to be by the system's viewpoint, which is someone who just watches sports or passes the time reading magazines or watching soap operas or whatever else is dished out to you, and your opinions are given to you. That's a good citizen, and that's a well-managed being. Prior to the setting up of the League of Nations, which transformed into the United Nations, League itself, it should be explained, League is a measurement. It's a measurement. It's Masonic. It's a league. That's why they call them leagues. prior to setting up the first League of Nations, which wasn't the first really itself, it transformed from the Concert of Vienna and different ones into the League of Nations, promoted by the bigwigs of Europe. They wanted a system that would run this coming society, which they knew was coming, since they were all working towards it. Plunderers always make sure that their offspring control the future. He who controls the past controls the future and the present. And so they're always making sure that their offspring will be well taken care of and still in command of the ship of planet Earth. Therefore, they had huge conferences in the 1800s, and they saw that eventually the plunderers, the pirates, would get to a stage where they would have a world society. Borders would come down. Common currencies would come into view. They'd have the 3 trading blocks, as Karl Marx talked about, under a supreme world government. But they also planned to use the sciences to control vast populations of people. It was not news to them way back then that most people who are good people and do all that they're told and trained to do, it was no news to them that most generations float through their life reacting to the changes in their life that's out of sight of their control. But they never figure out what's causing it, or the fact that they're meant to be kept off balance. It doesn't dawn on them. And they die not knowing. There were always some in previous generations amongst the elderly that could pass on wisdom, but that sadly has declined drastically since the scientific techniques of indoctrinations, especially through starting with schooling, took over and programmed them from birth, basically, certainly from kindergarten. A scientific technique which would give them fixed viewpoints on things, so they would come to conclusions if they were trying to figure it out, and they'd follow the paper chases that were laid out for them to follow, all the books and so on, to try and get to the bottom of things. And they go round in circles because the paper chases were the oldest trick since education was given to the general public. It was around the 1800s, industrialized Europe, where, because of the factories which were blossoming at the time like weeds, they had to get a basic education so that those who worked within the factories could follow basic guidelines and follow their jobs and take notes and write things down and all that kind of stuff. So they gave them a very basic type of education. Prior to that, teachers were almost nomadic. They would travel through countries, and individual families would hire them to teach their children. They certainly had a much, much better education because they were taught the classics, and they were taught Latin and Greek, so they could read original stuff going back for thousands of years in those languages and understand the nuances which are lost in translation. And they could understand the ingenuity of ancient peoples as far as thought goes and philosophy went, because it's all to do ultimately not just with controlling an individual yourself, but it's about controlling vast societies. When they gave the standardized education, and Masons will boast, their books will boast how they championed international education to get this on the books. And once that was done, we got the lowest form of education possible. They then went into motion to lay false trails of information for those they knew would come along, who would try to figure out the system in which they were born, and masses of books would appear, especially in the 1800s onwards, to do with the mysteries. And it wasn't to expose those who control the mysteries, it was to fuzzy the trail and lead you off in a billion false directions, all fascinating, mind you. People love to be fascinated, and they had very good storytellers. That's called the paper chase. You can buy books and books and books and books and go round and round in circles and still never figure it out. That's intentional. To further ensure that the masses, again, the common masses, the commoners are those who marry in common. Their spouses are not picked for them for certain qualities of intellect or whatever, or even aggression. The commoners meet someone, their hormones take over, and in the old days they used to just get married when the obvious offspring would come along. That was standard, whereas the elite have their spouses picked for them, matched up by a priesthood who keeps very, very long genealogies, and they mate them up for specific qualities. When the League of Nations decided to use these scientific techniques of controlling minds of people, using mainly the behavioralist theories, because within psychology there are different movements. There's a lot of psychology taught today and practiced today that's just New Age mixed with shamanism, and they charge big bucks when everything else has failed. That's where you'd go. However, the study of humanity is a different thing with sociology, and repeated experimentation with the behavioral sciences. That's a different thing altogether. When you understand how an individual will react in a certain circumstance, and the paths and steps he will take and follow after this particular experience, you can pretty well study the next one and the next one. If they all take the same path and go through the same emotions and come to the same conclusions, then you can apply that to whole populations. It's a fairly exact science used over and taken over long periods of study, and then it's implemented on the public. Honesty and openness was never ever going to be given in an upcoming system. In fact, the meetings that they had at the League of Nations viewed the populations of the world, the unenlightened masses, the profane, they viewed them almost like animals. Now remember, the League of Nations wasn't funded and put up there or elected by ordinary people. It was actually put up there to serve the interests of leading families who already owned countries. The same families who would have those countries warring with each other when need be to benefit themselves or a further agenda are the same families who ran the League of Nations, which became the United Nations. And being the hypocrites they are, they viewed the populations of the world, the commoners, as a problem. It's quite amazing projection, how you can project the faults that you have onto other people. It's very psychopathic when it's taken to this extreme. So rather than say, well, we'll do away with all of these big families that cause the wars, they turned around and said, well, no, we'll manipulate the minds scientifically of all of the populations. Then we won't have all of these problems anymore. The science has been used with tremendous effect for mind control purposes, and yet the mind control which people are under, they think is the natural system, simply because everyone else is under it. And they compare themselves with regards to normalcy by bouncing their opinions off their neighbours and their friends. When they get the same echoes back, like a radar, they think, well, I must be normal, I think the same things. You could train people to believe the earth is a cube, and you could give them 1 billion scientific reasons as to why, and rationalize it and redefine gravity working on every side. And after a population or so, 1 generation of the population, and propaganda and fake photographs, people would believe it. There's no big deal to lying to the public on a huge scale. In fact, it's easier than lying to a few people. When the general public believe they're living in a reality and they think they have a functioning brain, it's much easier to fool them all. H.G. Wells, who was a real propagandist for the Crown of England, who hated the commoners himself, even though he technically was from them. He was from a fallen middle-class family. Father was an alcoholic. His mother was a housemaid for an aristocratic family. And he was brought up in the home where his mother worked. He had access to the books and libraries. He liked the lifestyle. And he craved that lifestyle so badly of the aristocracy. He sold completely out to try and become one. World War I was necessary to kick off the whole globalist movement, because for the first time they had a world war. Initially they called it the Great War. Grand, the Great, it's all Masonic, you see, like the Grand Lodge. Whenever you hear that word to a person like Alexander or a war, you know it's a Freemasonic, much higher level Freemasonic part of a plan. Eventually they changed it to the World War because they followed it with a second. The Great War had propagandists on all sides working for it. What was unusual was that the King of England was really at war, supposedly or apparently, with his cousin in Germany. They looked almost identical. When you see the old posters for recruitment, your country needs you or your king needs you. Yet when you dig further back to the memoirs of the diplomats of that era, you'll find in some of them they disclosed the fact that the two kings got together at one point and talked about combining the peoples to take over the world. The Anglo-Saxon Germanic stuff, you see. And in World War I, because the King of England's family they still had a German name because they were German and Prussian, their advisors thought it better to change their name to Windsor, the name of a castle. And actually it goes back to a Tudor name which they adopted to make it more palatable to the public, rather than have them off to fight the nasty Hun, as they said. And that was Kipling who used that title. He also worked for the British government as a propagandist along with Wells. So Kipling came up with the Hun, the nasty Hun, to dehumanize the enemy, while H.G. Wells tried to get the youth involved, working towards a much bigger agenda which they would not understand. And he called it the war to end all wars. It sounded wonderful, you see, to the youth. Youth see things very simply in black and white. They don't know. They haven't lived long enough to experience the hypocrisy and the lies which governments indulge with in all the time. And so they see justice and injustice, and that therefore they're so easily manipulated by very old people who understand these things. So there we have the nasty Hun from Kipling, and we had the war to end all wars, which was a big lie too. And a whole bunch of stage theatre came out to do with the military and military families, and they used a white feather to show a coward, you see, who wouldn't go off and fight. And Wells and others encouraged the women to wear them in their hats if their fiancés or boyfriends refused to go off and march into battle standing up into hails of machine gun fire. And it takes a lot of training to knock out the common sense in people to make them do that. But that's what military is for. It's a uniform, one form. There is no more individuality once you put on a uniform. They drill it into you. So deception was agreed upon, was a normal method of controlling and guiding vast populations. The elites saw nothing wrong with this, they never did. The people who helped manage them all their workers, see nothing wrong with it, because they see the general population as children. They're just children. And you tell children all they need to know. Back to the information wars. There's no war going on with information. It's more of a rout. Because prior to even the beginning of the Cold War, agencies were set up to handle intelligence and counterintelligence and propaganda, to manage the minds of the public, to manage those who weren't quite happy with the reasons given for the way of things, and who would start looking for answers. And so they were supplied by departments and sub-departments and compartmentalized departments of intelligence agencies. Leaders are supplied to keep you busy and help you vent off steam. Venting off steam doesn't change anything. It gives the appearance of something happening, but it doesn't change anything. Ultimately, you're bombarded with information and disinformation. And just like the mainstream media, most of it is really trivia. Because so much information has been made available to the public about bills and who's passing a bill or putting a bill in or introducing bills. Who is Bill anyway? Eh? A very popular guy. In other words, laws. And it doesn't matter who's introducing what. Members of parliaments and governments are picked long before the public even hear their names. They're picked to be there. They're proven worthy, as the Masons say. They can keep their mouths shut and do what they're told. And it wouldn't matter if this guy or that guy was picked to introduce any bill. Faces are irrelevant, and so are the names. None of them would act by themselves. None of them. They would be brought down if they had an idea of their own. So they're told what to do. And you'll find you're bombarded with disinformation, some information, and repetition of the mainstream on what claims to be opposition radios, etc. This is what they meant by the information wars. People still think of wars like countries with flags and two sides facing each other. It's nothing like that at all. The war is within what you see as your own side. That's governed too, it's managed. We have so much information made available to us which can be verified, that the people of today who are trying to wake up or even think they've woken up will just come to the conclusion that they are the best informed slaves who ever existed. There's never been a time when you can find out so much information to bring you to that conclusion? We're the best informed slaves that ever existed. And I liken it to rats in a cage in a laboratory, where one day the rats get up early in the morning before the technicians come in and the white-coated scientists, and they discuss what they're going to do to us today. Are they going to stick these things in our brains and shock us? Will they snip bits out of our bodies? Will they drop us from great heights, then weigh us and dissect us? What will they do? And you see, that's what the people are left with in the Patriot movement. They vent steam off, but it's just going around in circles. Is what will they do to us next? Until you're in a living nightmare of apprehension, and you're brought to a complete standstill through fear and terror, which is meant to immobilize you. You can be immobilized and still walk through life. Your mind has been immobilized. That's what fear is meant to do. Counterintelligence, apart from mixing fact with fiction to discredit the truth, the fact, is also designed to immobilize people, to render them harmless, to put them out of action, so that there is no action. The standard old techniques used to the same extreme today. When you know you're being terrified constantly by someone you think you're following, you should question the motives. There are also those who do not understand, who think they're leading. But until they get clear as to what they're trying to keep and hold on to, then they won't know what they're fighting or why. You can't fight to keep a system that was not yours in the first place. It's a foreign alien system, you might say. It didn't just develop down through the ages, spontaneously, willy-nilly. It was guided and predicted. That's why you know nothing happens by chance at the top. Anything happening by chance would mean that the elite would lose control. And that's never been the case. They do not lose control because they don't leave things to chance. That's smart power. Getting back to the information wars, and now knowing that behind everything there's a very good reason which is given to the public, and then there is the real reason. Never forget that. Never forget that. Before I start off this little reading part here, I'd like to say that I got up this morning and it was a nice morning. The sun was shining. It was getting warm. In fact, it went above freezing. And then, as the morning rolled on, in came the aircraft and left all those chemical clouds, long trails, all kinds, which I'm giving names to now because there's different designs. You'll notice there's a little zigzaggy ones that stretch across the sky like a drunken man's stagger. There's the herringbone ones that go across with the spaced blobs coming down from the mainstream. Then you have the real polymer, mushy ones that have no defined outline. And this morning I saw them all. What a mess they made, all across the sky. And that's a real downer, of course, because you realize with the agendas as they are, and the fact they have began to teach young children in school that this is the new normal, you become to understand that this is intergenerational. They're going to keep this up. Interestingly enough, in the movies like Blade Runner, in the background of most of the shots outside, it was always raining. It was dull and always raining. So predictive programming can take many forms, often just with the background, to condition you to something. What's behind this? Apart from the rubbish about preventing global warming, we know when they're spraying, the warming process speeds up. Just watching it for the last few years, personally, it can show you that. It was begun under, never mind the long-term planning it took, officially it begun with the Open Sky Treaty. The Open Sky Treaty, to the public, again, a very good reason is presented. It was put forth as a way for other countries after the Cold War to monitor each other by observation flyovers. That's the good reason they give you. However, the reasons they go into don't make sense. For instance, to see if military establishments are being built, facilities to launch missiles, etc., and all of that stuff. Now, they have more hardware floating around in space than probably all the metals that were used in previous societies for all their wars. They have more satellites out there that can see the brand of chewing gum you're opening. And not these fuzzy pictures they show you during Gulf War I or II. They can pinpoint things exactly, and cloud covers nothing because they use infrared and different methods of seeing through all of this stuff. They can even see into the ground. Scientific papers in the past have boasted about this in detail. Yet they want flyovers, you see. So here's the good reason for the public thinking is to keep us safe, to make sure we're all, as the pirates and the Masons say, above board. Nothing is going on by subterfuge. And there's a whole bunch of legalities that would, you'd have to read it. It's so amazing to see the lawyer speak, the lie speak, that they go into, and screeds of stuff where foreign pilots can come in and fly your aircraft, even military aircraft, over your territory. And if they can't do it, they can get some other country next to you to do it for them, and on it goes. Very, very important project. Way too important, in fact, for simple observation. Which, as I say, by aircraft is obsolete, technically. They don't need it anymore. They have satellites to do all of that. But here's the very good reason they give us. And this is from the US government. And from the Open Skies Consultative Commission. This is the shorter blurb, the non-legalistic blurb they give you. You can go into all the legal stuff if you're really interested, and if you like all that kind of stuff. Personally, it bores me, as the party to the first party and the second party agree to the third party, etc., etc. All these parties all over the place. No wonder they get nothing done. The Open Skies Consultative Committee is supported by the Forum for Security Cooperation Support Unit in the OSCE Secretariat. The central focus of the committee is to discuss all questions relating to compliance with the treaty's provisions. Treaty on Open Skies. The Treaty on Open Skies was signed on 24th of March 1992 in Helsinki, Finland. Now, you can all go into the Helsinki Agreement and all that kind of stuff. That's, you'll notice, where most presidents and prime ministers go. It's the first big major meeting they head for, is the Helsinki meeting that's held every year. It entered into force on the 1st of January 2002. That's not true either. They've changed that because I have a memory. I remember them publishing this in the newspapers in Canada back in the 90s. says following ratification by 20 countries. The treaty, which is designed to promote openness and transparency in military activities, established a regime of observation flights over the territory of its signatories. Signatories are allowed to conduct observation flights using unarmed. You could really play around forever today with unarmed, because you'd have screeds of legalities just in there, depending on how you define arms, with high tech, etc. Fixed-wing aircraft to gather information about the military forces and activities of other states parties from Vancouver to Vladivostok. The treaty also envisages. Now this is the little clause that's the real reason. This is a little clause that is the real reason, not the camouflage. The treaty also envisages the possible extension of the open skies regime to additional areas. They always do. Get the law in the books, then expand it, you see, to the real purpose. To additional areas such as crisis management and protection of environment. That's the real reason. Now you can read all the rest of the additional stuff and the legalities and the yada 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 and all the nonsense, all the masses of camouflage, because that little paragraph here is the real reason, not the very good reason, but the real reason for the Open Sky Treaty. The treaty also envisages the possible extension, envisage is to see ahead, you see, the possible extension of the Open Skies regime, military term, regiment, regime, to additional areas such as crisis management and protection of environment. Now that tells you why would something to do with military establishments and nuclear weaponry, etc., why would they have to go into crisis management and protection of environment? Protection, not observation, but protection of environment. And below it has treaty members. There are more joining all the time, because this is happening on a world scale. And when you see the amount of stuff that's sprayed daily, pretty well, over your own heads, you realize this is drifting for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and sometimes thousands of miles to other countries, that ultimately no one can stay away from it. However, these are the main treaty members, and they will see the spraying over their heads, which has nothing to do, obviously, with observation. These aren't condensation trails. Condensation trails, as an aircraft comes across the horizon, you'll see it a few hand spans behind the craft. You'll see the tail of the condensation disappearing, as moisture would have to. It can't sit there forever like a big icicle. In the atmosphere, it dissipates into the dry air and disappears. The ones we see are not condensation, they're chemical. And remember what I just read, the treaty also envisages a possible extension of the Open Skies regime to additional areas such as crisis management and protection of environment. The treaty's 35 states parties are Belarus, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, the Kyrgyz Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, the Russian Federation, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Several other states have declared their intent to accede. So the real intent of the Open Skies Treaty was simply to deal with a threat from out there, the environment, you see. But it's also to do with controlling people, crisis management. Remember, this is a United Nations effort, and the World Health Organization that's part of the United Nations already years ago talked about lacing certain water supplies with tranquilizers to calm people who might just want to get rather nasty if their country was being taken over. That's on record. And people have been noticing the effects of the heavy spraying, sometimes on themselves and on people around them. In the summer you will see people who are like doped patients in a psychiatric hospital, wandering in and out of stores, the same blank expression, slow. Even the owners of the stores or the people who work there you ask for something simple, and you'd think that you just ask them to explain Euclid's theories on mathematics. It's beyond normal. It's beyond simply a hot summer's day, especially when they're inside. So I think they're using chemicals for multi-purposes here. But definitely, if you understand how an elite work in their headspace, you would use every weapon at your disposal on the general public if your plan is to take that same public through the biggest transition phase from one complete lifestyle to another. You don't want them thinking about things. You don't want their minds to be active. You want to avoid people complaining, forming groups and all that kind of stuff. So you would use everything in your arsenal to keep them dumb and stupid. And I know there are people out there who would never believe that that would be done to them by this group at the top, that they have been brought up to believe exist on some kind of totally selfless motivation to help others. That's why they're there, these unseen bureaucracies and levels of super government. They're all altruistic somehow. They come out of different wombs than anyone else. Therefore they don't have any nasty impulses. They're just there because they're servants of some kind. You don't elect any of them. They're just some kind of special servant that maybe God elects, I don't know, or appoints. And they'd never believe that this could be done to them. That's their conditioning. Complete conditioning. Because to break through into the realization that nothing is as it seems would probably take a nervous breakdown for most of them to come through that. Or at least a severe crash through the system where they find out that all of the social services, the safety nets, all the things they tell you are there to help you when you need them, don't really exist as such. At least it's a very, very different system altogether if you have to fall into the net. Some people are born with the ability to see through. Many are caught at school and stuck on drugs such as Ritalin. But most of the people who get hypnotized every night by television will never come to that conclusion. You can't live in both worlds and retain your clarity or your sanity. Television is the biggest tool they've ever given the public, apart from inoculations, which certainly do attack the brain. We see that with all of the problems with autism and the subdivisions thereof. We see it in today's people who have short-term memory. They have low concentration. We're definitely far, far weaker physically than people of even a couple of generations ago. We've been re-engineered, which is another reason they went for the food and kept it secret from the public while they tested it on the public by agreements with governments such as Canada, who admitted, yeah, they made secret agreements with the big ones like Monsanto. Secret agreements with your food, the most basic thing you can have. You are what you eat, so they say. It certainly didn't make food any cheaper or better. So why did they use such immense brain power in science and mix hundreds of genes together to make one brand new stalk of corn? You'll be the last to know. Because the real world and the real ones who run this world will never tell you truths. It's done by deception. In a sense, it's done by a form of diplomacy. Diplomacy is a way of getting what you want, often without the other person even figuring out how you give them, how that you give up what the other wants. It's a chess game. Huge departments work just on the wording of documents to give the general public one view which will be peddled to them by media, while the insiders can read it another way. So legally they didn't lie to you, they just worded it in such a way you'll take the exoteric meaning and think no further, especially if some person on television that's very popular, some mainstream news anchor person, tells you what you're supposed to think. You won't question it any further, you won't check in yourself. That's how simply this stuff is peddled into our minds. The Open Skies Treaty was decided generations ago. H.G. Wells talked about the police of the world, the new Freemasonry of the air, scientists who would spray over hostile territories, and gases and different things would affect the minds of those below and render them silly and stupid and helpless in the shape of things to come. The new Freemasonry of the air, the air police. H.G. Wells was no genius. He simply was given files of info from professors at Oxford and Cambridge, predictive programming, and his job was to write stories around them which would implant the intent in your mind through a fiction which you would enjoy, and they certainly were enjoyable. He also belonged to the Fabian Society, a founding member that was steeped in eugenics, a society that believed that the sciences should have the right to dictate to the public of the world how to live, what your purpose in life was, how many of you there should be. Your betters, your intellectual betters should decide for you. That really was what was behind them. They all believed they were superior. And the Fabian was taken from the Emperor Fabian the Roman, or the general who would plan strategies years and years ahead of actual events, and by slow incremental implementation of certain things he would achieve his goal unnoticed by those who were being taken over. The Fabian way. And that's what's been happening. And it wasn't invented by the Fabian Society, it was already on the go prior to that. When you look at the main characters who alter our mindsets primarily through fiction, that sell way better than any dry, factual book, fiction appeals to the public. We have an imagination. The image is within image, you see. And they supply the images, which people then worship. And when you worship something, you try and emulate it. Predictive programming. The world we live in is not a hallucination. It's an illusion, which is a distortion of reality. Distortion. It's not difficult to understand how it's been manipulated up until this point. When you realize the sciences of human behavior were understood thousands of years ago, and the knowledge was never lost. The milestones of life are understood, and because of that you can be pretty well guaranteed that people 25 and under, or maybe even 30 and under, are definitely preoccupied with hormonal drives. It's prime in their minds, an instinct which they must obey. So they're out of the running. They're very easily used, of course, because they have more open minds. They can put the image in imagination. They use imagination more. And you can predict that which will sit there for the rest of their lives through fiction, ideas, etc., which will carry to their death, never realizing how it got there, like a virus put in by a program on your computer. It works very well. Wells wasn't the only one. In the 40s and 50s they gave us other authors, science fiction, who made us all excited about space travel. Even now, an incredible tiny minority ever get to travel in space, or ever would get to travel in space. And it certainly wouldn't be as exciting as Star Trek or any of the novels that people have gobbled up over their lifetimes. We have a pioneering spirit within us for adventure. And because of that, those who understand it supply and download into us the predictive programming. It never occurs to us why we should be spending billions of bucks throwing junk into space to begin with, when there's so much to be done on Earth here, where the money that comes from our labour should go towards. We take for granted, though, it's a kind of norm. Yet NASA and these big companies, these highly secretive organisations, whose real job is nothing to do with what they tell you, it's to do with putting up hardware which will ultimately monitor every individual worldwide and control them. But we don't question it. We're given the fascinating stuff that intrigues us, and made to almost wish we were up there too, you see. Doing exciting things, only be bored out your mind, cramped in a little place, going round and round the Earth. And having to get out once in a while and fix some other piece of military hardware, which is the other function of the space shuttles. The real purpose, maintenance of these military machines. And all of that came into being with the farce of the Cold War, which they called the arms race. Great con it was, where governments in the West said, oh, look at that big nasty bear over there, the Russian. They're miles ahead of us. The same technique they used in World War II when they claimed that Britain had no aircraft and the Germans had, oh, thousands of them. Same con, same con. And it worked so well. Oh, they're going to blow you up, and they showed you all these movies of US nuclear weapons going off, and houses getting blown away in the desert. At the same time telling you that hiding under your table would save you. There's your dialectic in motion, the helplessness of it all. It's a wonderful con trick which works. And so they kept saying, oh gee whiz, these Russians have got all these missiles, way more than we've got. And then the government's taxed and taxed and taxed, and he says, well, I guess they have to just keep us safe. But all that stuff had nothing to do with weaponry, as we thought it was. It was to do with the advancement of sciences which would be used down the road after they declared the Cold War was over, there was a thaw, and would all be monitored and controlled by high tech. That's what the purpose was. Research and development, unlimited financing. The scientists of the Soviet Union and the Western countries met every year, the top scientists, and discussed it. It was in the newspapers. Why would you do that if they said that the winner of the Cold War would be those who had the best, most advanced sciences? Well, you'd never allow them to mix, would you? Till you realize it's all a con, and we're both sharing the same information. The Russians worked because they had to work hard in research and development. Everybody worked towards something they believed in. That's how you con peoples and populations. The West simply use it as an excuse to get billions and billions and billions, trillions actually, of dollars into special projects which are now coming into fruition openly and being used. And a lot of it hasn't been used on the public. That's still to come. So all that stuff had nothing to do with building all these weapons when we had enough weaponry supposedly to blow the world up. Hundreds of times over, they declared. The money went into a system, a worldwide network that would be used to control the populations of the world, because it was the populations of the planet, not the leaders, but the populations that had to be brought under a common system and controlled. And that's what the real intent of the Cold War was. So I'll leave you all to do your homework on the Open Skies Treaty. Look into the OSCE, the OSCC, and all the related documents, and ask yourself if this makes sense to you. Compare it to what your eyes can see on most days if you look up. And as I said, remember, everything that's presented to the public, for everything there must be a very good reason. And then there is the real reason. It's not for us to be given truths, just good excuses. From me and Hamish, it's good night, and may your God, or gods, go with you.